The Forgotten Shadow. It started with whispers. Ruth had recently moved to Black Hill, a small, fog-cloaked town nestled between mountains and an ancient, winding river. She came from a bustling city, leaving behind a messy breakup and a sense of burnout that felt like it had seeped into her bones. She craved quiet and solitude, a chance to regroup. Black Hill was meant to be a temporary retreat, and when she found a listing for a charming, inexpensive house on the outskirts of town, she jumped at it without a second thought. The house itself was a relic of an earlier century. Each room was outfitted with creaky floorboards, ornate woodwork, and antique fixtures that spoke of a time when people relied on candlelight and fireplaces to keep warm. The narrow dirt road leading to it wound between tall, swaying trees that seemed to press close, adding to the sense of isolation. Ruth felt oddly at peace in her new surroundings, finding comfort in the quiet hum of the nearby river and the rustling leaves in the evenings. The first night, she fell asleep easily, cocooned by the quiet and the sense of privacy she had longed for. But by the second night, her sleep was broken by something unexpected: whispers. They were faint at first, a soft sound just beyond the edge of her awareness. At first, she thought it was the wind or the settling noises of an old house. But when the whispers became clear, actual words, soft as breath yet distinct enough to hear, she felt a shiver run down her spine. Ruth. Her name. The voice was barely more than a sigh, but it held a desperation that kept her up for hours. She lay in bed, every nerve on edge, listening to the whispers drift through her room, growing and fading, sometimes close, sometimes distant. The next morning, Ruth tried to laugh it off. Old houses creak, she reminded herself aloud, hoping to break the eerie silence that seemed to cling to the rooms. But the feeling of being watched lingered, creeping into her thoughts throughout the day. The isolation that had once been so inviting now felt strange, even oppressive. Each night, the whispers would return, growing slightly louder and clearer, calling her name in tones that sent chills down her spine. And soon, Ruth noticed something even stranger: the presence of a shadow, lurking at the edges of her vision. The shadow was never in one place for long. She would catch glimpses of it in the hallway, near the staircase, or hovering in corners where the light didn't reach. It was as if something, or someone, was there with her, watching, waiting. She dismissed it as a trick of the light at first, the result of poor sleep and an overactive imagination. But the more she tried to rationalize it, the more she felt that the shadow was real. On the sixth night, unable to sleep, Ruth decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and crept through the darkened house, hoping to find the source of the whispers. They seemed to echo from every wall, filling the rooms with an almost palpable tension. Her heart pounded as she moved through the house, the flashlight trembling in her hands. As she neared the end of the hallway, she felt an inexplicable pull toward the attic. The attic door was in the ceiling at the end of the hallway, a small trapdoor with a dangling cord. She'd barely noticed it when she moved in, assuming it was just another dark, dusty space. But tonight, it felt like the attic was drawing her in, as though something, or someone, was waiting for her there. With a deep breath, she pulled the cord, and the attic ladder creaked down, unfolding like the legs of a skeletal creature. A rush of stale, cold air met her as she climbed the ladder, flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the thick darkness above. The attic was small and nearly empty, save for a few old boxes covered in dust and cobwebs. She scanned the space, feeling the walls close in around her. But just as she was about to turn back, something caught her eye. In the far corner of the attic, a shadow seemed to be moving, its form dark and shifting, like smoke trapped in a jar. Ruth's breath hitched. She shone the flashlight directly at it, but the beam seemed to pass right through. The shadow didn't dissipate or retreat, it stayed there, hovering in the corner, almost, watching her. Ruth, the whisper came again, clearer and louder, as if the shadow itself was speaking. Please, remember. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled down the ladder, slamming the trapdoor shut. She locked herself in her bedroom, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. But nothing added up. The voice, the shadow, it felt too real, too tangible to be a trick of her mind. Over the following days, Ruth grew more and more unnerved. The shadow followed her through the house, appearing in mirrors, lurking in corners, casting eerie shapes across the walls at night. She began to feel as though the house was alive, every creak and groan a response to her fear. She tried sleeping with the lights on, but it made no difference. The shadow was always there, waiting in the dim light, whispering her name in soft, desperate tones. Determined to find answers, Ruth turned to the town's library, hoping to uncover the house's history. She pored over old records and spoke to locals, most of whom seemed wary of the house, exchanging uneasy glances whenever she mentioned it. Finally, an elderly librarian named Mrs. Acker agreed to share the story with her. The librarian told Ruth about a girl named Clara who had lived in the house nearly 100 years ago. Clara was known to be a quiet, reclusive girl, often seen lingering by herself with her nose in a book. As a child, she had been fascinated by shadows, insisting to anyone who would listen that she could hear them, that they whispered secrets to her when she was alone. Then, one night, Clara disappeared. Her family searched everywhere, the house, the woods, the river, but she was nowhere to be found. Days passed, then weeks, and eventually, she was presumed dead. The only trace she left behind was a single word scratched into the wall of the attic, remember. Mrs. Acker looked at Ruth with solemn eyes. Some say her spirit never left. They say she's waiting for someone to help her, to remember her. Ruth left the library, her mind racing. Could the shadow really be Clara's? Was that why it was calling her name, following her around the house, desperate to be remembered? It sounded impossible, but every instinct told her it was true. That night, as she lay in bed, Ruth felt a strange sense of calm. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the room with an almost tangible weight, but she no longer felt afraid. She realized then what she had to do. She rose from bed, grabbed the flashlight, and made her way to the attic once more. The shadow was waiting for her, darker and more defined than ever, its shape shifting and twisting like a living thing. Ruth, the voice was soft, pleading. Please, remember. What do you want? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadow seemed to reach out toward her, and suddenly, memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. She saw flashes of Clara's life, her lonely days spent hiding in the attic, the whispered conversations she shared with shadows, and the final moments of despair as she vanished into darkness, leaving nothing behind but her shadow. Ruth understood then that Clara had not disappeared, she had become part of the house, her spirit trapped in shadows, bound to the walls and floors, waiting for someone to remember her, to set her free. With tears in her eyes, Ruth whispered, I remember you, Clara. I remember. The shadow seemed to shiver, light piercing through the darkness. Slowly, it began to fade, melting into the walls, the floors, the fabric of the house. The whispers grew softer, fainter, until they were nothing more than a distant echo. In the silence that followed, Ruth felt a profound peace. The weight that had pressed on the house lifted, leaving it brighter, warmer, as if Clara's spirit had finally found rest. In the years that followed, Ruth stayed in the house, eventually calling it home. And sometimes, late at night, she would sit by the window, listening to the wind and the river, feeling a quiet presence beside her, a gentle reminder of a spirit that had been remembered, and a shadow finally set free.